Hi, my name is Pip Coombs. This is my review of the Book of Daniel by Jeff Apter, and I'm trying to keep the reflection off of this book. I'm sorry, but it is a library book, and so it does have cover on it. So this is the story of Daniel Johns, the lead singer of Silverchair, and it is sold as the Book of Daniel from Silverchair to Dreams. So I picked this up because I love Silverchair. I have loved Silverchair from the beginning. I grew up listening to Silverchair music. I grew up watching them on TV, and I grew up aware of the eccentric ways of Daniel Johns, and he is who I think of when people talk about a tortured artist. He is who I think about when people talk about a creative genius. This man has so much talent, it's unreal. I think that there are really very few bands that can, or artists that can take you on a journey with them as they mature, as they go through different parts of their life, as they expand their creativity. I think usually they lose you along the way, or they stay in a kind of safe sound, particularly for musicians. I find that there are a lot of bands, and I'm not going to say any because some are very popular and I will get slayed for it, but every album kind of sounds more or less the same. They definitely have their own sound and they stick to it, and that's fine because it's kind of nice because it's reliable. You know that you're going to get something that you probably like from their next album because it's probably going to sound the same as the last album. But I mean, I really appreciate the journey, but I think it's really rare that the artist successfully takes you on that journey. And the work of Daniel Johns, and I mean, really early on, it became very obvious that Daniel was the creative force behind Silverchair and everybody else was just along for the ride. But Daniel Johns is one of those few artists where I'm in for the journey. I want to see what he creates. I want to hear what he creates. I have mostly enjoyed the things that he's created. I'm not as into the electro pop stuff that he's produced now, but I still want to hear it, and I can still see how he's progressed from the grunge days of Frog Stomp with Silverchair to where he is now with Dreams and the electro pop stuff. And I think what he's done is put just a little hint of where he came from in each new piece, and I think if you go back and listen to his work, you can see little hints of where he was going to go, and I just think it's a really fascinating journey to listen to. And I mean, you don't, just because you're along for the ride and you want to see everything that an artist creates doesn't mean you have to like it. Like I said, I don't like some of the newer stuff he's released, but some of it I do. But it started with a love of Silverchair, and so that was why I picked up this book. And I thought, if it's really from Silverchair to Dreams, like it says it is, then it'll be really interesting to see, because I think a lot of Australians actually think that Daniel's kind of off the rails at the moment, because we get fed that by the media, and we see pictures of him, you know, sleeping outside his home on the ground after a night out, or you hear stories. And yeah, I think that there's a lot of us who think that Daniel's not in the world's best place at the moment, and that might be true, but I thought that maybe this would be more insightful than it actually is. And I think ultimately what I walked away thinking from this book was that it should really be called The Book of Daniel about Silverchair. Really, the part about his post-Silverchair work, it basically was like the exact same thing you'd read in the first 3 articles of the Daily Mail if you Googled Daniel Johns. Like, there was no real insight into who he's become, what kind of work he's creating, and where he's trying to go now, except that he wants to leave Silverchair behind for fairly understandable reasons, and that he wants to create different sounds and experiment, which I think is fairly obvious from the different music he has been releasing over the last 5 or 6 years. So as much as I enjoyed this book because I was reading about someone I'm fascinated by, there were a lot of things I didn't like about this book. So one of the things was that I would read something in the book and then I would jump onto YouTube because I'd be like, oh, I remember seeing that on TV when I was younger, and you'd find the old performance or whatever on YouTube and you'd watch it. And a lot of the quotes that came out of this book were like, it was basically like the author had sat down and watched everything that was on YouTube about Daniel Johns and had chosen his quotes from those YouTube videos and had made his assessments about Daniel and Silverchair from those videos with very little actual real life experience or exposure to Daniel. And that kind of annoyed me as I was going along. I probably shouldn't have done that while I was reading the book. But the trouble is they reference songs that I hadn't listened to in ages, and then I'd listen to them like Emotion Sickness, and I bloody love that song. And I don't know, I just hadn't listened to it in ages. And like Straight Lines, oh my God, that song reminds me of the first year I lived out of home after finishing uni, and life was so amazing and fun, and it was the best parts of being an adult without yet having responsibilities, and it just reminds me of a really happy time in my life. And so it was really lovely to read some things about that and then go back and listen to Silverchair again and listen to some of their work and just relive the memories. So that part I really enjoyed, but what I didn't like was that I could have got the same effect by just watching a few YouTube videos. I guess maybe that's normal for biographies, especially when your subject is such an intensely private person who doesn't give out a lot of interviews, who has had some issues with anxiety and things like that. But I kind of, I hope for something more from a biography. I hope that by sitting down and reading it, I'm going to learn something that I couldn't learn on YouTube, or some sort of insight from an interaction that is more than I could get from the Daily Mail. I don't know. At the end of reading this book, I actually found, I'd seen it before, but I found the Diorama documentary, and there was this really couple of lovely quotes, which was, if I've got a vision for a song, we don't stop until that vision is fulfilled. And I'm aware that it's a risk, what I'm doing. I didn't go out of my way to be different. It just came out, and I didn't alter it to please anyone. And in the book and in the documentary, they refer to Daniel as an undefeated romantic and an informed optimist. And that was an interesting way to look at Daniel Johns, because I think from the outside, so much of his life has been tortured and dark and difficult. And the really sad part was in the documentary and in the part of the book where they're referring to him as, an undefeated romantic and an informed optimist, you knew that things were about to get really bad for Daniel again. And so that was kind of sad to know that. Like a lot of people who have followed Silverchair and Daniel Johns, I knew that when they released Diorama, he had some significant health issues. He had reactive arthritis. And I remember in the time at the media, we were aware that he had physical issues, but a lot of how it was sold was that it was more just the eccentric Daniel Johns, and I didn't realize really how bad it was. And I don't think I walked away from the book understanding how bad it was. I think I got that from the Diorama documentary on YouTube. And I really think that the book should have captured that same idea. I think that it was really clear that this man really physically struggled. His body was attacking itself, and that was a side effect of the fact that his immune system was compromised because he'd had anorexia. And they do go into it in the book, but I just don't feel like it really captured it as much as it could have. And this is a man that's really struggled and suffered. And I remember seeing him in the petrol station when I would have just recently had my license. I wouldn't have been much older than 18. And I don't know if that works out timeline-wise, but I know I was driving by myself. And I went to the petrol station and I was paying for my petrol, and the people in front of me had just paid and turned around and came out, and I just went, whoa. And it was Daniel Johns and Chris Joannou, and it took a while for me to recognize them. And this is a band I love, and it took me a while to recognize them because that was how ill Daniel looked. And it wasn't until later that I realized that that was in the kind of anorexia part of his life. And possibly from reading this book, as he was coming out of that and was being medicated for a lot of the anxiety and things and depression, where he was then kind of in a haze. But when I saw him, I was shocked by how unwell he looked. And yeah, I don't know that they really captured that adequately in this book. One of the areas they did talk about in the book was how difficult it was to get the album Diorama to really achieve much, because Daniel was so sick that they couldn't really go out and promote it. And I remember when they performed Greatest View at the Arias, and I remember people talking about it being a big deal, that Daniel hadn't really been able to lift up a guitar for quite some time prior to the performance, and therefore it was a really big deal that he was coming out and doing this. But again, I remember it being sold as the eccentric Daniel Johns a little bit as well, and I remember it being an amazing performance, and I bloody loved that album. And part of what they cover in the book is that that performance and one other on TV performance was one of the reasons that Diorama sold as many copies as it did. But it's also, his illness is one of the reasons why Diorama is an album that a lot of people haven't heard of, and it didn't do as well as it should have. And it's an amazing, amazing, amazing album. And it's just so creative. And like, I think there are so many times over the course of Silverchair's life, and that you will discover in this book if you read it, that that Daniel Johns was just having such a hard time, and it was clearly visible in his art and clearly visible on the stage. Like, you could tell the man had anorexia. He was so thin and he was just unwell. And then after he came back and played at the Arias, I mean, I thought he looked pretty healthy, but looking back at it again, with older, more matured eyes, you could see how frail he still was. And then I remember, like, when Young Modern came out and Straight Lines exploded through Australia, and I remember they were touring with Powderfinger, and I went to their concert 2 nights in a row, and it was amazing. And I remember seeing him so healthy and buff and confident for like the first time ever. And I thought, wow, finally the good times are rolling for Daniel Johns and Silverchair, and things are onwards and upwards, and the dark times are behind a poof, then it was over. Silverchair broke up. And yeah, so it's certainly, the man has had an interesting life. I'm not sure that this book does it justice. But then again, he is also intensely private. So he is a difficult subject to cover, but I think it could have been done better. So, I mean, if you're really interested in Silverchair and the life of Daniel Johns, check the book out. It is interesting, but in the same breath, I think you'll get more from watching things like the Diorama documentary online and a few other things. But I mean, I would say probably the most insightful thing I got from this book that I didn't find on YouTube and hadn't known from, previous exposure to Silverchair media was Ben Gillies' relationship with his mother, and how that affected Silverchair, and how money affected their relationship. And I don't think I realized quite how much Silverchair became the band of Daniel, and Chris and Ben were really just along passively almost for the ride. Even though it was obvious that Daniel's the creative genius behind the whole thing. I also think that I didn't obviously know much about his younger years, and I think the other thing that it gave a little bit of insight on was why Silverchair broke up. So, I mean, Silverchair have been pretty quiet about why they went into their, indefinite hibernation. which was devastating when I heard that. But this, I mean, it was fairly obvious that Daniel was leaving because he wanted to explore different creative avenues, and I think that's pretty obvious from the work that he has put out since. But I think you kind of see the lead up to that and how they came to that point a little bit more clearly as a result of reading this book. That being said, you know, it's hard. I feel very meh about the book, but I don't feel meh about the subject at all. So it's a tricky one to rate. Daniel Jones is an interesting man. This book, not so interesting and not as insightful as I would have liked.